For me personally, I grew up playing video games. I live in LA and I'm the same age as the characters as we end the book. And for me, yeah, it was like interesting to learn about LA in the 80s and 90s when I wasn't here. It was so interesting learning about game development because as someone who plays them, I've obviously never made them. But my question for you is, how much of your life have you poured into this book and these characters, and who represents what?
I think that anytime you write a book, you start from yourself as the center of that book. You have to be, and so I think like when you're writing your first novel, basically you're kind of good with just, drawing from your life exactly. But if you write more than one, you're going to have to invent some things, And so for me over the years, I am the center of things insofar as to know yourself means, well, is the only way you can write other people, to kind of like acknowledge your own like prejudices and privileges and figure out what distance you are from the people you're attempting to depict. So, most of the things come from my life, but translated. I share a background with Sam, like we're both half Jewish and half Korean. And, obviously a lot of Sadie's experiences as a woman in the arts maybe come from me. These are my cities. Like I've lived in Los Angeles and Cambridge in New York and in Tokyo, actually. Those things are all me, but I'm not a game designer. I have played for 40 years and I am the daughter of two computer people, which is my dad is a computer programmer and my mom also worked at IBM in marketing.
Oh,
And
wow.
so I've had, so all of these things are, I guess, the things that circle around to become tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow.
And that's where you get that authenticity. That's how you can really, really bring these characters to life because you're like, it's a lived experience. It's funny because you said here, not everything has to win awards. And I'm going to use that as a segue to talk about the feedback and the response that this book has had because it has swept up, like it has cleaned shop. It came out in 2022 and then sort of dominated the entire year. Goodreads, it was voted the best book of the entire year. What was it like having a book that has been so well received and impacted people in such a fundamental way? Like your words did that.
It is amazing. I will say just a thing about myself. I find, and I think the book is about like love, art, video games, and time, but also about failure fundamentally,
Yeah. And
And
grief.
so,
Yep.
in so essentially, what I find about myself as a human is that kind of like happiness or success feels like it passes in a more fleeting way for me. Like I don't know how much I feel it, but if I fail, I will feel that and be able to live in that for a while. And so it's funny. I just kind of feel like emotionally, I pat myself on the head and say like, "That's nice. What's next?" About any of these things, and they don't seem to like absorb. But then there were so many things that happened with it. So when the book came out and like up to it, people were excited about it, but so many people were like kind of resistant to the concept. They are not like you. They were people that were just like, I don't game. I have no interest in gamers. I don't see what that has to do with my life. Like
Yeah.
can there even be a good novel about gamers? Don't we already have Ready Player One? I think they didn't even really understand what kind of novel like it was. And so the weird thing is, so over like the book comes out in July. Over those like 6 months, it's kind of this process of like my publisher, I believe, like and other people that kind of kept talking about the book wearing down their resistance. You know what I mean? And so until finally you kind of hit December, and then people were just like, no, no, we love it.
Right,
So
right.
so it's been that experience really of like feeling that initial resistance to it, even though it came out and did quite well right off, that there was
You
still like
could
a
say
lot of
really
people that just
well.
were like, it did well, but it actually has done better as like it has gone on, is kind of what I want to say about
Mm.
it. And
But that's word of mouth as well. Like that's
I
someone,
think it's totally word of mouth,
yeah.
but it's funny because like, we had discussions at the publisher about like kind of how to position the book. And, a message they wanted to position was that you didn't need to like video games to like this book, to find
Hmm.
something about it, for yourself. But the thing that created is that like every single person who writes a review of the book, like whether in both professional venues like the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, the Washington Post, or, on Goodreads or something, feels the need usually to weigh in about whether they are a gamer or not. Right at the head, like
Like that's the
I have
most
no
important
interest.
part. Right.
Right, exactly. And so, the thing that's funny about that is it's like you don't read a book about like, I don't know, you don't read All the Light We Cannot See, and say, I was never in World War II,
Yeah. Yeah.
something like that. I'm like, just like give yourself over to the world. So that's kind of been, it's been an interesting thing to watch people's reactions as it moved through the world,
But what a way to make it black and white.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think like, for me, it's a book that is about not really video games and much more about people that make things. I think like, video games are the subject, they're certainly like a rich subject, but it's really about sort of the difficulty of the creative process and about being like young and brilliant, but how that doesn't necessarily make you
Perfect.
nice to be with.
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know, how being the smartest person in the world room doesn't like protect you from just life, or yourself or your emotions, that kind of
Also,
thing.
what's
So,
really interesting, you're saying where it's like, well, I don't really play video games, therefore I don't know if this book is for me. You have a beautiful moment in this book where you've used Sam as sort of like a way to talk about to expand horizons. And that was a passage in the book that it stopped me in my tracks. And that
mm,
is, if we only ever delve in our experience and what we know and not sort of like share or learn or be inspired by other
mm,
cultures or, what's in this world, then we're just going to have our own tunnel vision. And it's like the way that you said that moment in the book for me was so powerful. And I feel like it acknowledges, yes, we've grown as a world in the last decade alone so much. And it's like, if something was created back then, it's allowed to exist in that time. That we
yeah.
can't put the standard or the pressure of a current day back on something when it didn't exist then. But it was also really, and it was a huge conversation we had last week in the book club, because we split the book over 2 weeks, where we
Mm,
talked about inspiration, being inspired, and I used anime as a great example, where it's very much, anime is from a Japanese studio and it has a global fan base. And I was inspired by anime as a kid, and it was like that permission to enjoy
right.
media culture. Yeah, and I just wanted to thank you for that, because I thought that you just said it in such a beautiful way.
Well,
What?
I feel like uniquely positioned in a way to maybe have some thoughts about that because, again, I share the exact same background as Sam, but I don't necessarily share precisely his thoughts about every subject. But what something is true that comes from my background is that knowing that I am like half Jewish and half Korean, as Sam is, that doesn't really give me a particular monopoly on understanding the experiences of either Jewish or Korean people. And
Mm.
yet, if you think about it in terms of how like the appropriation issue has kind of like come down, we sometimes act as if that's so, that if you are one, part of a culture, that means you know everything about everything in that culture. And it really just isn't true.
Yeah.
All because what I know from myself is all I can really know are the particularities of my own experience. And because I know how very particular they are, I think it ends up being kind of, again, maybe not correct to extend the idea that like I have a particular ownership over the experience of all Jews and all Koreans
Mm.
of all time in all places. But that said, I will say that when I started out writing, it never even occurred to me to write somebody like me at the center of a narrative. I think if anything, I thought that, fiction was a mask I could wear and that I wanted to, as much as possible, have the characters not resemble me and, so that there would be no possible way you would think they were me. And as time has gone on and as my own thinking has changed, I realized, fiction didn't have to be a mask, that
Mm.
fiction could actually be quite like revelatory in its way. But the thing that really interested me about thinking about Ichigo across time was probably, that very thing across time, the ways in which you can be on the right side of something in 1995 and find yourself on the wrong side of it in 2012. Like I'm not making a judgment about whether they are right or wrong, and
Mm.
obviously there's a difference between appropriation and influence,
Yes.
or
Yep. Or
appropriation and
appreciation.
inspiration.
Yeah.
Yeah, or all of those things. But for me, I would think it would be a sadder world if we weren't allowed to kind of be inspired and to like open ourselves up to other cultures and sometimes incorporate that into the work we do.